Is it possible you've had a near-death experience and didn't even know it? That's what happened to me. I found out recently that I actually had a near-death experience when I was 2 weeks old. I'm sure you're wondering, how did I find that out? I'll let you know that, but first I want to tell you how I had these amazing experiences as a child, and I thought everybody would have them, and basically that was a heightened sense of psychic abilities. But it turns out that this is what happens to people that have had near-death experiences. I've interviewed over 100 people on my show called Exploring Death, and it's amazing that most of them, if not all of them, have had increased psychic abilities after their near-death experience. So one of the things that I experienced as a child was seeing spirits. At night I would go to bed, and the way that my curtains were, I could see out the window. And every single night I would look out there and I would see spirits. Generally they were dressed as cowboys and Indians. I lived in the mountains of Colorado, and so I'm feeling as though those spirits had all stayed there on that land after they had died. And it was so scary to me. I would run into my mom's room and, she didn't believe me, but then when I was crawled into bed with her and I'd look out her windows, I could see them there too. And another thing is that I didn't see the extraterrestrials, but I remember being terrified at night that they were going to put medicine in my mouth and poke needles into my toes. And so I had to sleep a certain way in order for that not to happen. And I truly believe that this was happening, or else why would I make that up? How could a 3 or a 4 or a 5-year-old even imagine that kind of scenario unless it was actually happening? Another thing that happened was hearing voices. It wasn't as much as a young child that I would hear the voices, but as I grew up, I would hear voices. For example, when I met my first husband, I had just started at Price Waterhouse in San Francisco. I was a CPA for them. And I was sitting in the conference room, and in walks Ian Sharp. And in my mind, I hear a voice, clear as day, saying, "Now there's a man you could marry." I was blown away. Sure enough, 2 years later, we were married. And then after he passed away, I was in another situation where somebody said, "Hey, so-and-so's here, do you want to meet him?" And I was like, "Sure, why not?" And when I turned around and I laid my eyes on him, I heard the exact same words, "Now there's a man you can marry." And sure enough, 2 years later, we were married as well. So it's pretty crazy to think that, who needs a dating app when you can just have a voice in your head tell you, there's your next husband. Another activity that happened as a child, which I believe came from my near-death experience, was talking to God. As soon as I could start reading, so maybe 5, 6 years old, I would read the Bible and have conversations directly with God. And I don't think that is something that most young children do just randomly. I think it was because I had this direct connection after having my near-death experience when I was 2 weeks old. So how did I discover that I had this near-death experience? Well, first of all, let me tell you, I'm Lisa Jones, and I had a shared death experience when I was 37, where I left my body and got to witness my husband being entered into the kingdom of heaven, and it was the most extraordinary, transformational experience of my entire life. And so, like I mentioned a couple years ago, I actually had a guided meditation that took me back to a time in my life. I was working on childhood trauma and working through some of that, and so it had me go to a point in time where I experienced something that would help shed light on what this trauma was that I had been dealing with. And sure enough, it took me to this moment when I was 2 weeks old. I was in a nursery and being taken care of by random strangers. I had been given up for adoption at birth, and so I had been staying in the unwed mother's home until my adoptive parents arrived maybe a week later to pick me up. So in the meantime, I was being cared for by just random people coming in and feeding me and taking care of me. And if you can imagine being a little baby, not having, your mom there or somebody that you really felt loved you, I was feeling very abandoned and alone. I also had colic, where I was screaming and crying all the time. I had so much pain in my belly that I just cried all the time. And so in this moment in the guided meditation, I saw this woman pick me up, and she was so frustrated with me crying that she shook me. And if you're aware of shaken baby syndrome, That's how babies die, or they can die. And so what happened with me is I popped out of my body. My little spirit body just said, that's it, I am out. The next thing I know, I was in the most beautiful place with all of these angels surrounding me and cuddling me and helping me and telling me that as much as they wanted me to stay with them, that I had to go back, that I was only just starting my journey and that things would get better, but that I had no choice. I couldn't stay in heaven and that I had to go back into my body. And so that is how I discovered I had a near-death experience when I was 2 weeks old. So I'm curious if you had any of these heightened psychic abilities when you were a child, because if so, you may just have had a near-death experience yourself. I would love to invite you to download my free guided meditation called Exploring Death. It's in the notes below. I hope you enjoy it, and until next time, aloha.